I was already halfway into my truck when I saw it, a bright orange violation notice flapping under my windshield wiper like a warning flag. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Then I read the amount, $300. The Homeowners Association was charging me a road usage fee for driving on the very road beneath my tires. A road I didn't just use, a road I built. Years before the HOA even existed, I paid out of pocket to clear the land, grade it, lay gravel, and maintain it myself. Every inch of it runs through property deeded in my name. And now they were threatening fines, towing, and restricted access if I didn't pay up. Restricted access to my own home. I stood there staring at that paper, feeling insulted in a way that's hard to explain. Not just angry, offended. Like someone had walked into my house, pointed at my couch, and demanded rent for sitting on it. The wording was smug, confident, like they assumed I'd panic, pull out my wallet, and comply. That's when it clicked. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't an error. This was a shakedown. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Chaos and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? I didn't buy into this place looking for a fight. I bought it because I wanted quiet, space, something solid I could build with my own hands. Years ago, I found a stretch of raw land just outside a small rural town where the hills rolled wide and nobody told you how tall your grass could be. There were no manicured entrances, no matching mailboxes, no boards or committees. Just land, trees, and a long dirt path that barely qualified as a road. That road didn't magically exist. When I bought the property, access was nothing more than rutted ground and guesswork. So I did what you're supposed to do. I hired licensed contractors. I paid for grading. I hauled gravel. I went down to the county office, filled out the paperwork, and got the permits approved. Inspectors came out, signed off, and told me I was good to go. I kept every receipt, every approval, every stamped document in a folder I never thought I'd need again. For years, that road was just part of my daily life. I maintained it myself. After storms, I filled washouts. In winter, I cleared it. If a neighbor needed access during an emergency, I didn't hesitate. There was no drama, no conflict, no one claiming ownership over something they hadn't lifted a finger to create. Then everything around me changed. Developers showed up. Trees came down. Houses went up in neat little rows. What used to be open land turned into identical roofs and vinyl fences. And with them came the HOA. Suddenly there were rules, newsletters, meetings, and a woman named Marilyn Crosswell at the center of it all. From the very beginning, Marilyn carried herself like someone who'd finally been given authority after waiting her whole life for it. She spoke in absolutes, loved phrases like community standards and uniform appearance. Every conversation felt less like a discussion and more like a warning. Her obsession wasn't just order, it was control. At first, I didn't think much of it. My property sat just outside the main cluster of homes, and my road didn't run through anyone's yard. But that didn't stop Marilyn from taking interest. She started asking questions. Who maintained the road? Who approved it? Why didn't it match the HOA's paving plan? That's when the language shifted. She stopped calling it my road and started calling it shared infrastructure. According to her, because several HOA homes used the road to reach the main highway, the association had administrative oversight. I corrected her politely. I showed her the deed. I showed her the permits. I explained slowly and clearly that the road existed years before the HOA and sat entirely on my land. She barely looked at the paperwork. Instead, she smiled the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes and said, "We'll review it." A week later, the first notice arrived, $300, unauthorized road usage, due within 10 days. I assumed it was a clerical error. I emailed. I attached scans of the documents. I offered to meet in person. The response came back short and dismissive, repeating the same phrase over and over. HOA policy. More notices followed. Same amount. Same wording. Same assumption that I'd eventually give in. What bothered me most wasn't the money. It was the confidence. The way they acted like ownership was something they could vote themselves into. Marilyn began seeking other board members, framing the situation as me, refusing to cooperate. Suddenly, I was the problem homeowner, even though I wasn't part of their association and never had been. Then came the threat that made my stomach drop. If I didn't comply, the OA would explore access control options, barriers, physical obstructions. They were threatening to block the only road to my home, the road I built, unless I paid them for the privilege of using it. I stood in my kitchen rereading that email, feeling something shift from irritation to disbelief. This wasn't about maintenance or fairness. This was about forcing submission. I sent one final response, clear, calm, documented. I reiterated ownership. I warned them, politely, that interfering with access to my property would be illegal. Marilyn replied within minutes. We're prepared to proceed. That's when I understood exactly who I was dealing with. Not a misunderstanding, not a miscommunication, but a calculated move by someone who believed authority came from confidence alone, and that most people would back down before testing it. I wasn't most people. After that, the notices didn't just continue, they multiplied. What had started as one ridiculous fee turned into a steady stream of harassment, each letter more aggressive than the last. One week it was unauthorized driving, accusing me of using the road too frequently, as if I was somehow trespassing on my own land. The next week it was commercial wear, claiming my truck was causing damage and therefore subject to additional charges. Then came unauthorized guests, warning me that visitors to my home were violating HOA traffic limits. Visitors to my house. I started finding the notices everywhere. Tucked into my mailbox, slipped under my door, taped to my windshield late at night. Each one carried the same thinly veiled threat: pay up, or we'll make your life difficult. And they weren't subtle about how far they were willing to go. Several letters mentioned towing at owner's expense. Others hinted at daily fines that would accumulate until compliance. That's when my family started feeling it too. Packages arrived late because delivery drivers were warned not to use the road. Friends hesitated to visit after hearing rumors about cars being towed. Every time I left the house, there was a knot in my stomach wondering if I'd come back to find a boot on my truck or a notice claiming another violation. The stress seeped into everything. Sleep was harder. Meals felt rushed. Even quiet evenings didn't feel quiet anymore. I tried to handle it the reasonable way. I sent emails, long ones, short ones, polite ones, firm ones. I attached copies of the deed again. I included county permits with dates clearly showing they predated the HOA by years. I even offered to sit down with the board and walk them through everything, step by step, like adults. They ignored most of it. When they did respond, it was always the same tone, cold, condescending. Marilyn Crosswell would sign off every message with that same polished confidence, assuring me the board had reviewed my concerns and determined I was still in violation. No explanation, no counter-evidence. Just authority asserted like a fact of nature. I attended a meeting, hoping maybe face-to-face conversation would break through whatever power trip was going on. I brought a folder thick enough to make my point undeniable. Deeds, permits, maintenance records. I laid them out neatly on the table. Marilyn barely glanced at them. Instead, she talked about precedent and community expectations. She warned that allowing individual exceptions would undermine the HOA's ability to govern. When I pointed out, calmly, that I wasn't part of their association and never had been, she smiled and said, "That's your interpretation." That was the moment I realized logic wasn't welcome in that room. The violations kept coming, sometimes 2 in the same week. Each one felt designed not to win a legal argument, but to wear me down, to make me second-guess myself, to make me wonder if fighting was worth the exhaustion. I could almost hear the unspoken calculation behind it all. Most people fold when the pressure gets constant enough. I started noticing other things, too. Marilyn's emails always went out late at night, like she wanted them to be the last thing I read before bed. Deadlines were always tight. Language was always urgent. It was psychological pressure dressed up as policy. Neighbors stopped making eye contact. Some were sympathetic but afraid to say anything. Others had clearly heard a very different version of the story, one where I was the stubborn troublemaker refusing to work with the community. Marilyn had framed it that way on purpose, turning isolation into another weapon. I tried one last time to de-escalate. I sent a final packet, certified mail, containing every document, clearly labeled, with a simple letter asking them to confirm in writing what authority they believed allowed them to charge me. I gave them time. I stayed professional. The response came back shorter than ever. Fees stand. Noncompliance will result in enforcement. No citations. No explanations. Just force. That's when the anxiety turned into clarity. They weren't confused. They weren't mistaken. And they certainly weren't interested in the truth. They were betting on intimidation, on the idea that fear, inconvenience, and social pressure would make me cave long before a courtroom ever came into play. Standing there holding that letter, I understood something important. This was never about a road. It was about power, and whether I'd let them pretend they had it. After that last letter, I stopped responding the way they wanted me to. No more rushed emails. No more trying to convince people who clearly didn't want to be convinced. Instead, I took a day off work, grabbed the thick folder I'd been carrying around for weeks, and drove straight to the county records office. The building was old, the kind of place that smelled like paper and dust and time. I took a number, sat down, and waited while the ceiling fan clicked overhead. When my turn came, I explained the situation calmly, without emotion, and slid my documents across the counter. The clerk took her time. She didn't rush. She didn't interrupt. She pulled up maps on her screen, cross-referenced parcel numbers, and flipped through recorded plats that predated half the neighborhood. After a while, she leaned back in her chair and looked at me over her glasses. The easement the HOA was leaning on didn't give them what they claimed it did. It allowed limited pass-through access for emergency services, nothing more. It didn't grant control, fees, tolls, or governance. More importantly, the road itself was clearly labeled in the county records as private access, constructed and maintained by the property owner. In other words, they had no leg to stand on. As she printed out certified copies, the clerk hesitated, then lowered her voice. She said this wasn't the first time she'd seen this association's name come up. Apparently, they had a habit of testing boundaries, with homeowners who didn't know better, pushing until someone either paid or sold. Most people never checked the records. They just assumed the HOA knew what it was doing. I walked out of that office with something better than anger. I walked out with leverage. From that moment on, I treated the situation like a project instead of a personal attack. I started documenting everything, and I mean everything. Every email got saved. Every voicemail was archived. HOA meetings were recorded, legally and openly. Notices were photographed the moment they appeared. I sent all communication by certified mail, forcing signatures and timestamps into existence. I stopped explaining myself. I stopped arguing. I let them talk. and talk they did. The HOA responded to my silence the only way they knew how's escalation. The fines jumped from $300 to $900, stacked with administrative penalties. They floated the word lien like a threat they were excited to use, implying they could place a legal claim against my property if I didn't comply. It would have terrified me a month earlier. Now, it just confirmed what I already knew. Every new violation became another brick in the case they were building against themselves. Their letters grew sloppier. Claims contradicted earlier statements. Dates didn't line up. They cited authority they didn't have, using phrases like automatic enforcement and non-negotiable access fees, none of which existed in any governing document. Meanwhile, I was building a timeline. I logged the first notice, the follow-ups, the meetings, the threats. I cross-referenced them with county records and HOA bylaws. The pattern was undeniable intimidation first, legality never. Marilyn Crosswell's name appeared on every decision, every notice, every escalation. She wasn't just the face of it, she was the engine. What surprised me most was how calm I started to feel. Once I stopped reacting emotionally, the fear drained out of the situation. I wasn't scrambling anymore. I wasn't defending. I was preparing. Each aggressive move they made only strengthened my position. They thought silence meant surrender. In reality, it meant strategy. By the time the next letter arrived, threatening liens and loss of access pending board action, I didn't even flinch. I filed it neatly in my folder, updated my notes, and started making calls. They were still playing bully. I had moved on to something far more dangerous to them proof. By the time I called the attorney, I wasn't angry anymore. I was precise. I wanted someone who dealt with property disputes, easements, and overreaching associations for a living, someone who wouldn't be impressed by bluster or intimidated by letterhead. When we met, I laid everything out on the table in chronological order. Deeds first, permits next, county certifications, then the notices, the emails, the meeting transcripts, the threats. He didn't interrupt once. He just nodded, flipped pages, and made notes in the margins. When he finally looked up, he said something that shifted the ground beneath this whole mess. They're not just wrong, they're reckless. He explained it in plain terms. Charging a fee for passage over a privately owned road is illegal tolling. Collecting money without authority is unauthorized fee collection. Claiming control over land they don't own or have any right to govern is misrepresentation of property rights. Each one on its own was a problem. Together, they formed a pattern that courts don't look kindly on. A few days later, the HOA sent what they clearly believed was their finishing move. Final demand. Letter dripping with legal language they'd borrowed from somewhere else, warning that failure to pay would result in liens, blocked access, and further enforcement actions. It was the kind of letter designed to scare people into compliance without ever seeing a judge. I didn't respond. Instead, my attorney did. The reply was brief, factual, and devastatingly calm. It informed the HOA that all future communication would go through counsel. It requested written justification for their claimed authority. It cited specific statutes regarding private roads and illegal tolling, and it politely warned them that continued harassment could expose the association and individual board members to liability. I remember reading that letter twice before it went out, feeling something close to relief for the first time in weeks. Not triumph. Relief. Because now the rules had changed, and I wasn't alone in it anymore. The response from the HOA was exactly what my attorney predicted. They ignored it. Instead of backing off, they escalated. Another notice. Another fine. Another threat, this time more aggressive, more confident, as if daring me to blink. Marilyn Crosswell's name was right there at the bottom, bold and unapologetic. She was banking on the assumption that lawyers were bluffing tools and homeowners eventually cracked. What she didn't realize was that every letter they sent after that attorney notice wasn't pressure anymore. It was evidence. At my attorney's suggestion, I let it continue. I didn't provoke them. I didn't taunt them. I didn't interfere. I simply allowed them to keep talking. Every violation they issued, after being formally warned, strengthened the case. Every claim they repeated without proof made their position weaker. They were documenting their own misconduct in real time. Behind the scenes, my attorney was organizing it all into something clean and undeniable. Illegal tolling documented by invoices. Unauthorized fee collection demonstrated through payment demands. Misrepresentation of property rights laid bare by comparing their claims to recorded county documents. It was all there, neatly aligned, ready for daylight. The HOA seemed almost frantic now. Deadlines shortened, language sharpened. They referenced automatic liens that didn't exist and enforcement powers they never had. They contradicted themselves, sometimes within the same paragraph. The more pressure they applied, the clearer it became that they had never expected resistance at this level. I watched it unfold with a strange sense of calm. The fear they'd tried to instill had burned itself out. In its place was something steadier. Confidence, backed by facts. I stopped checking my email obsessively. I stopped losing sleep over tow trucks and gates. The power dynamic had shifted, and they didn't even know it yet. The most satisfying part was how little I had to do. No shouting, no confrontation, no dramatic gestures. Just patience. Just letting an organization drunk on its own authority walk itself deeper into a hole it didn't realize was there. By the time the next letter arrived, threatening liens again, louder than before, I didn't even feel a flicker of doubt. I forwarded it to my attorney, added it to the growing file, and went back to my day. They thought they were tightening the noose. In reality, they were building the case that would end this on my terms. The meeting was scheduled for a Thursday night, announced in one of those mass emails that pretended to be friendly while clearly signaling trouble. Mandatory attendance encouraged, it said. I knew exactly what it was going to be. Marilyn Crosswell wanted a stage. She wanted an audience, and she wanted to make an example out of me. The room was packed when I walked in. Folding chairs lined up in neat rows, neighbors whispering, board members sitting at the front like judges behind a long table. Marilyn was already there, seated in the center, papers stacked high, posture stiff with confidence. She smiled when she saw me. Not warmly, but the way someone smiles when they think they're about to win. She opened the meeting with a speech about community cohesion and fairness, carefully framing the situation as if I were some outlier trying to dodge responsibility. Then she said my name loud enough to make every head turn and invited me to explain myself. It was meant to be humiliating. I stood up slowly, feeling every eye on me, and walked to the front with my folder in hand. I didn't rush. I didn't raise my voice. I started by laying the documents out one by one on the table in front of the board. The original deed, county-approved permits, recorded plats, construction invoices showing exactly who paid to build the road and when. I explained calmly and clearly that the road existed years before the HOA, that it ran entirely through my property, that the easement they kept referencing didn't grant them control, fees, or authority. I didn't editorialize. I didn't argue. I just presented facts. The room went quiet. For a moment, I thought it might actually end there. That reason would finally land. That someone on the board would ask a real question or suggest a pause. Instead, Marilyn leaned forward and laughed. She dismissed the documents as outdated and said the HOA's interpretation overrode individual paperwork. She warned that allowing private roads To operate outside HOA oversight would set a dangerous precedent. She doubled down hard, repeating the same threats she'd made in emails, now amplified by a room full of witnesses. That's when my attorney stood up. He introduced himself calmly, stating his name and role for the record. Then he did something Marilyn clearly hadn't anticipated. He issued a formal warning out loud in front of everyone. He explained that the HOA had no legal authority to charge tolls on private roads, no right to collect fees, and no power to restrict access to privately owned property. He warned that continuing enforcement could expose the association and its board members to significant liability. He asked, plainly, if the board wished to proceed. Marilyn didn't even hesitate. She waved him off, declared the warning, noted, and announced that enforcement would continue until I came into compliance. The confidence in her voice wasn't strength. It was arrogance, the kind that only exists when someone has never been challenged before. The meeting ended in a blur of murmurs and uneasy looks. A few neighbors approached me quietly afterward, apologizing, admitting they hadn't known the details. Others avoided eye contact altogether. Marilyn walked past without a word, chin high, convinced she'd just asserted her authority. She couldn't have been more wrong. The next morning, my attorney filed the paperwork, a formal legal action supported by months of documentation, meeting transcripts, and recorded warnings. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't emotional. It was thorough. As I signed the final page, I felt a strange calm settle in. The confrontation was over. The line had been crossed. And for the first time since that orange notice appeared on my windshield, the outcome was no longer uncertain. They'd chosen to ignore the warning. Now they'd have to answer for it. The courtroom wasn't dramatic in the way television pretends it is. There were no raised voices, no theatrical objections, no stunned gasps from the gallery. Just hard wooden benches, flat fluorescent lights, and a judge who carried the quiet expression of someone who had seen this exact abuse of power more times than he could count. That, more than anything, worked against the HOA. When our case was called, my attorney stood and began exactly where this all started. Not with emotion, not with outrage, but with facts. He walked the judge through the timeline step by step, when the land was purchased, when the road was constructed, how it was permitted, inspected, and maintained, and how the HOA didn't even exist until years later. Every point was backed by a document. Every date matched. Nothing was left to interpretation or opinion. The judge asked a few clarifying questions, slowly turning pages, pausing longer and longer on certain exhibits. You could see the picture forming in his mind as the pattern became impossible to ignore. Then it was the HOA's turn. Marilyn Crosswell's attorney tried to reframe the issue, arguing that the road functioned as community infrastructure, simply because HOA residents used it. He talked about uniform standards, shared responsibility, and reasonable assessments. But the arguments fell apart almost immediately. Each claim collapsed the moment the judge compared it to the county records sitting right in front of him. The easement didn't say what they claimed it said. The bylaws didn't grant the authority they insisted they had. And worst of all, the HOA had continued issuing fines and threats after receiving a formal legal warning that they were acting without jurisdiction. The judge stopped, looked up over his glasses, and addressed Marilyn directly. His voice was calm when he asked if she had personally authorized the continued enforcement after being notified by counsel that the HOA lacked authority. She said yes. That single word changed everything. The ruling followed swiftly and without drama. The HOA had no authority to charge fees for the use of a privately owned road. The so-called assessments were illegal. Any attempt to block access, impose liens, or enforce penalties was prohibited immediately. But the consequences didn't end there. The court ordered the HOA to refund every dollar collected under that scheme, not just from me, but from any homeowner they had charged using the same false justification. Damages were awarded for harassment and unauthorized fee collection. The association was ordered to cease all enforcement related to private access roads unless explicitly granted authority by recorded agreement. Then the judge turned back to Marilyn. He cited her personally for abuse of authority, noting that she had ignored documentation, dismissed legal warnings, and knowingly continued enforcement without justification. His tone never changed, but the message was unmistakable. Leadership does not place someone above accountability. I glanced at the board members seated behind her. Some looked stunned. Others stared down at the table. A few couldn't bring themselves to look at anyone at all. This wasn't just a loss for them. It was exposure. Emails, meeting minutes, and enforcement records were now part of the public record, stripped of spin and excuses. When the gavel finally came down, it was done. Outside the courtroom, Marilyn walked past without a word. The confidence she once carried was gone, replaced by something tight and brittle. Neighbors who had stayed silent for months offered quiet nods. A few murmured congratulations. The balance of power had shifted completely. I hadn't shouted. I hadn't broken a rule. I hadn't paid a single dollar of their illegal fees. I had simply let the truth stand where intimidation failed. And for the first time since this all began, the drive home felt like what it had always been meant to be, mine. The weeks after the ruling were strangely quiet. Not the tense, watchful silence that had followed the first violation notices, but a calmer kind, the kind that settles in after a storm passes and everyone steps outside to see what's still standing. For the first time in months, I wasn't checking my email with a knot in my stomach or scanning my windshield for fresh notices. There were no threats, no deadlines, no posturing. The HOA went into damage control almost immediately. An emergency meeting was called, then another. Marilyn Crosswell was removed from her position as president before the end of the month. The board released a carefully worded statement about organizational restructuring and moving forward in the best interests of the community. No apology, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing, just the quiet removal of the person who had driven the association into a legal wall. Policies were rewritten. Enforcement procedures were paused, then revised. Anything even remotely touching private property or access roads was stripped out or sent for legal review. The tone of HOA communication shifted overnight, from aggressive and absolute to cautious and vague. The same board that once threatened liens now sounded like they were afraid to send an email without a lawyer reading it first. Refunds went out quietly. No announcements, no explanations. Checks arrived in mailboxes with neutral memos and no return addresses that drew attention. I knew I wasn't the only one getting them. Word travels fast in small communities, even when no one says anything out loud. Neighbors started stopping me in private. In the grocery store, at the gas station, on the edge of the road, always quietly. Always with the same mix of relief and gratitude. Some thanked me for standing up when they were too afraid to. Others admitted they'd been paying similar fees for years, convinced they had no choice. A few apologized for staying silent. I didn't hold it against them. Fear does that to people. As for me, life settled back into something that felt normal again. I drove my road without thinking about it. I worked on my property without worrying about who was watching. Friends came over without hesitation. The constant background stress, the low-grade anxiety that had seeped into everything, slowly drained away. The road itself never changed. Same gravel, same view. But it felt different now. Protected, affirmed. No longer something that could be claimed or leveraged by people who had nothing to do with its existence. The HOA, once loud and omnipresent, faded into the background. They still existed, of course, but they were no longer feared. They no longer ruled by intimidation. Every decision came with hesitation now, every notice softened by disclaimers and legal language. Power, once exposed, doesn't recover easily. What struck me most was how quickly the illusion collapsed once it was challenged. All that authority, all that confidence, gone the moment someone demanded proof. The community healed quietly, no celebrations, no victory laps. Just a shared understanding that things had gone too far, and that they didn't have to stay that way. I didn't win anything flashy. I didn't come out richer or louder or more powerful. I came out with something better. Peace. And sometimes that's the most complete victory there is. Looking back on all of it now, what still surprises me isn't how far the HOA went. It's how easily they were able to do it, for as long as they did. Not because they were right, or because they had real authority, but because most people don't question power once it sounds confident enough. They count on that. They count on silence, on fear, on the idea that fighting back will cost more than giving in. What I learned is simple, but it matters. Authority only works when people stop asking for proof. The moment you slow down, ask questions, and demand documentation, the illusion starts to crack. That's why intimidation is always louder than the truth. It has to be. If you're dealing with something like this, don't assume you're wrong just because someone says so on official letterhead. Know your rights. Pull the records. Keep the emails. Save the notices. Document everything, even when it feels tedious or unnecessary, especially then. You never know which piece of paper will end up being the one that changes everything. I didn't set out to make a statement or teach a lesson. I just wanted to get home on the road I built without being shaken down for it. But in the end, standing my ground didn't just protect my property. It restored something much bigger: balance. Quiet won. Facts won. And the intimidation faded the moment it was exposed. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Chaos. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?